You know what's funny about the Galactic Council? They've got species that can manipulate time, others that can phase through solid matter, and one particularly obnoxious bunch that communicates exclusively through interpretive dance. But somehow, they all managed to agree on one thing. Humans were absolutely, categorically, mind-numbingly stupid. And honestly? Fair point. Captain Alex Rivers of the Earth Defense Force vessel. Stubborn bastard. Yes, that was its actual designation. The naming committee had been having a particularly rough day, was currently demonstrating humanity's legendary tactical brilliance by doing something that every other sentient species in the galaxy considered the equivalent of juggling live grenades while riding a unicycle through a minefield. He was chasing the Zephyrian battle fleet. Not running from them, mind you. Chasing them. With extreme prejudice and what his grandmother would have called entirely too much enthusiasm. "Sir," Lieutenant Commander David Park said from his position at the tactical station, his voice carrying that special tone that subordinates use when they're pretty sure their commanding officer has finally snapped. "The Zephyrian fleet is increasing speed." "They're now at, they're really booking it, sir." "Good," Rivers replied, settling back in his command chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just figured out the punchline to a particularly good joke. "Means they're learning." The bridge of the stubborn bastard was a testament to humanity's approach to starship design. If it wasn't held together with equal parts advanced engineering and pure spite, it probably wasn't worth building. The walls were lined with displays showing everything from engine efficiency to the mess hall's weekly poker standings, because apparently someone in Fleet Command had decided that if they were all going to die horribly in the void of space, they might as well know who owed whom credits first. "Sir," Park continued, clearly struggling with some internal debate about whether to voice his concerns or just quietly update his will. "Respectfully, standard engagement protocols suggest that when an enemy fleet retreats, we usually let them go. You know, declare victory, maybe send a stern diplomatic note, have some celebratory drinks." Rivers turned to look at his tactical officer, and Park immediately regretted every life choice that had led him to this moment. The captain had what could generously be called a learning expression, the kind of look that suggested he was about to explain something very obvious to someone very dense. "David," Rivers said, using that patient tone usually reserved for small children and particularly slow houseplants, "what's the most important rule of human warfare?" Park blinked. "This wasn't covered in the Academy handbook." Know your enemy? Nope. Superior firepower? Nope. Don't get dead? Getting warmer, but no." Rivers smiled, and several bridge officers unconsciously took a step back. "The most important rule of human warfare is this. If they start something, we finish it. And finishing it means making absolutely 100% certain that they never, ever want to start something with us again." He gestured toward the main screen, where the Zephyrian fleet was visible as a collection of rapidly shrinking dots against the starfield. "Those guys showed up at the Kepler colony 3 days ago, demanding tribute." "Tribute! Like we're some kind of primitive species that's going to hand over our lunch money because they've got bigger ships." "To be fair, sir," Chief Engineer Lisa Kowalski chimed in from her station, "they do have bigger ships. A lot bigger. And more of them. And significantly more advanced weapon systems." "Details, Lisa, details." Rivers waved dismissively. "The point is, they made a fundamental error in judgment. They assumed that because we're new to the galactic neighborhood, we'd roll over and play dead the moment they showed up with their fancy ships and their, what do they have again? Those weird tentacle things?" "Plasma cannons, sir," Park supplied helpfully. "Right, plasma cannons. Anyway, they figured wrong." Rivers stood up, which was always a bad sign. When Captain Rivers stood up, things tended to explode shortly afterward. "It was practically a law of physics at this point. So we're going to chase them all the way back to their home system?" Park asked, already knowing he wasn't going to like the answer. "Oh, David," Rivers said, his smile widening. "We're going to do so much more than that." Chapter 2: The Zephyrian Perspective, or How We Learned to Stop Worrying and Start Panicking. High Admiral Zexthal of the Zephyrian Empire was experiencing what humans would have called a very bad day. Though Zephyrians didn't actually have days in the traditional sense, being more of a constant twilight with occasional atmospheric disturbances kind of species. Still, the concept translated well enough, especially when your supposedly easy conquest had turned into a nightmare of cosmic proportions. The bridge of his flagship, Inevitable Victory, Zephyrians were nothing if not optimistic, was in what could charitably be called controlled chaos, and more accurately described as barely contained panic with a side of existential dread. "Report!" Zexthul barked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd conquered 14 star systems and was really hoping to make it to retirement without adding catastrophically embarrassing defeat at the hands of primitives to his military record. Subcommander Yithtal, whose job it was to deliver bad news in the most diplomatically palatable way possible, stepped forward with the expression of someone about to perform a particularly unpleasant medical procedure. "Sir, the human vessel is still pursuing us. In fact, they've gained on us." "Gained?" Zexthal's voice rose to a pitch that would have been considered unseemly for a Zephyrian of his rank, if anyone had been foolish enough to point it out. "How in the seven hells of Morduk have they gained on us? We have the fastest ships in the sector." "Yes, sir, that's what makes this particularly concerning." Yithtal consulted his datapad with the careful attention of someone reading his own obituary. "According to our sensors, they shouldn't be able to maintain even half their current velocity. Their ship's design is, well, it's charitable to call it questionable, sir." Zexthul moved to the main display, where the human vessel was visible as an angry-looking speck that seemed to be held together by what his ship's computer had analyzed as stubbornness and possibly some form of metallic prayer. It was, by all rights, an impossible machine. The engines were too small, the hull was too thick, the weapon placements made no tactical sense, and the entire thing seemed to have been designed by someone who'd learned about space travel from particularly violent children's drawings. And yet there it was, gaining on the most advanced fleet in the Zephyrian Armada like a particularly determined predator chasing down its prey. "Sir," Communications Officer Plithmore said, his voice carrying the kind of carefully controlled terror usually reserved for people who just realized they were standing in a minefield. "We're receiving a transmission from the human vessel." "Put it through," Zexthul said, because he'd reached that point in the crisis where he figured things couldn't possibly get any worse. This turned out to be a significant error in judgment. The main screen flickered, and suddenly they were looking at what was presumably the human captain. He was sitting in what appeared to be a command chair, though it looked more like something designed for extreme comfort rather than military efficiency. Behind him, other humans were going about their duties with the casual air of people who were having a perfectly normal day, despite being engaged in what any reasonable species would consider a suicidal pursuit of a vastly superior enemy force. "Afternoon, folks," the human said, and even through the universal translator, there was something deeply unsettling about his tone. It was the voice of someone who was enjoying himself far too much. "Captain Alex Rivers here. Just wanted to check in, see how you're doing. You seem to be in quite a hurry." Zexthul drew himself up to his full height, which was considerable by most standards, and only slightly less intimidating when you considered that he was currently fleeing from a ship that looked like it had been assembled by particularly optimistic scavengers. "Human," he said, putting all the authority of the Zephyrian Empire behind the word. "You will cease this pursuit immediately. We are withdrawing from your system. The matter is concluded." The human captain's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that he found this tremendously amusing. "Oh, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. You see, the matter isn't concluded. In fact, it's barely gotten started. We have withdrawn our demands," Zexthul continued, feeling like he was negotiating with some kind of natural disaster that had inexplicably learned to pilot a starship. "There is no reason for further conflict." "Well, that's where you're wrong," Rivers said cheerfully. "See, you showed up at one of our colonies, made some threats, fired a few warning shots, generally acted like the kind of folks who don't play well with others. Now normally that might be the end of it. Different species, different customs. Maybe we all learned something about galactic diplomacy." He paused, and his smile widened in a way that made every Zephyrian on the bridge unconsciously take a step backward from their screens. "But then you made a mistake. A big one. You assumed that just because we're new around here, we'd be reasonable about it." The transmission cut off, leaving the Zephyrian bridge in the kind of silence usually associated with funeral services, and particularly awkward family dinners. "Sir," Yithtal said finally, "what do we do?" Zexthul stared at the screen where the human ship continued its relentless pursuit, and for the first time in his long and distinguished military career, he had absolutely no idea. "Run," he said quietly. "Run faster." Chapter 3. The Learning Curve. The thing about humans, Captain Rivers reflected as he watched the Zephyrian fleet execute what could generously be called evasive maneuvers, and more accurately described as panicked fleeing, was that they had a tendency to exceed expectations. usually in ways that made other species question their life choices and, occasionally, their faith in a rational universe. Take the stubborn bastard, for instance. By all rights, it should have been a perfectly respectable mid-range cruiser. Decent firepower, reasonable speed, adequate shielding, and the kind of boring reliability that military procurement officers love to put in their reports. Instead, it had somehow become the ship equivalent of a honey badger. Small, mean, and possessed of an absolute refusal to acknowledge that some fights were supposed to be unwinnable. This was largely due to Chief Engineer Lisa Kowalski, who had the kind of relationship with physics that most people had with overbearing relatives. She acknowledged its existence, listened politely to its rules, and then did whatever she damn well pleased anyway. "Engineering to bridge," came her voice over the comm, carrying that particular mix of pride and mild concern that meant she'd either solved a problem or created 3 new ones. "You wanted more speed, Captain." "I've got more speed." "Define more speed," Rivers said, because experience had taught him that Kowalski's definition of improvement and the rest of the universe's definition didn't always align. "Well, the good news is, we're now capable of maintaining pursuit velocity indefinitely. The bad news is, I had to bypass about 14 different safety systems to do it, and the engine room now sounds like a mechanical dragon with indigestion. And the worst news? I'm not entirely sure what's going to happen when we actually catch them." Rivers considered this. In his experience, most problems could be solved through the application of sufficient enthusiasm and a willingness to ignore conventional wisdom. This had served him well throughout his career, from his early days as a junior officer, when he'd solved a diplomatic crisis by challenging an alien dignitary to a drinking contest, to his current position as captain of a ship that was rapidly becoming legendary for all the wrong reasons. "Cross that bridge when we come to it," he decided. "How long until we overtake them?" "At current acceleration, about 6 hours, assuming their ships don't spontaneously develop the ability to violate more laws of physics than we are." "Excellent." Rivers turned to his tactical officer. "David, what's our weapons status?" Lieutenant Commander Park consulted his displays with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust good news where this particular ship was concerned. "All systems green, sir. Though I should point out that our missile reserves are limited, and the Zephyrian fleet still significantly outguns us." David. Rivers shook his head sadly. "You're thinking like a conventional tactician. Fire missiles, hope for the best. Maybe ram something if all else fails. But that's not how this works." What works, sir?" "Psychological warfare." Rivers gestured toward the main screen, where the Zephyrian fleet was visible as a collection of rapidly moving dots that seemed to be trying very hard to be somewhere else. "Right now, they're not running from our guns. They're running from the idea of us. They've realized that humans don't follow the same rules as everyone else, and that terrifies them." Park blinked. "Sir, are you saying we're winning through intimidation?" "I'm saying we're winning because they've figured out something that the rest of the galaxy is still learning. Humans are fundamentally unreasonable." Rivers settled back in his command chair with the satisfied air of someone explaining a particularly elegant mathematical proof. "Every other species out there has rules, protocols, ways of conducting warfare that make sense from a tactical, strategic, and economic standpoint. But humans? We've got one rule. If you start something with us, we will end it, and we will do it in the most excessive, over-the-top, borderline insane way possible." "And that's good?" Park asked uncertainly. "David, 3 days ago the Zephyrian Empire was the regional power. They had the biggest fleet, the best technology, and a reputation for swift, decisive victories over anyone foolish enough to oppose them. Today, their entire battle group is running away from a single human ship that, by all rational standards, they should be able to swat like a bug." Rivers smiled, and Park was beginning to understand why enemy commanders found that expression so unsettling. "Now imagine you're some other alien species, thinking about maybe picking a fight with humanity. You hear about today, about how the mighty Zephyrians fled from one ship that wouldn't know when to quit. What do you think? Do you decide we're an easy target, or do you maybe find somewhere else to be?" "Ah," Park said, beginning to see the bigger picture. "Deterrent effect." "Deterrent effect," Rivers confirmed. "We're not just chasing one fleet, David. We're establishing a reputation. And in this galaxy, reputation is everything." The comm crackled to life again. "Bridge, this is Sensors. We're picking up some interesting chatter from the Zephyrian fleet." "Put it through," Rivers ordered. The bridge filled with the sound of alien voices speaking in rapid, agitated tones. The universal translator struggled with the overlapping conversations, but the general gist was clear enough. Panic, confusion, and a growing sense that this wasn't how things were supposed to go. Impossible acceleration curve. Never seen anything like it. recommending immediate transition to hyperspace. But the treaty specifically forbids. Forget the treaty! They're gaining on us! Rivers listened with the expression of someone enjoying a particularly good piece of music. You hear that, folks? They're starting to understand. Understand what, sir? Park asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. That when you mess with humans, you don't just get a fight. You get a demonstration. Chapter 4. The Galactic Community. Ways in news traveled fast in the galactic community, especially when it involved something as unprecedented as a single human vessel, pursuing an entire Zephyrian battle fleet across 3 star systems. By the time the stubborn bastard had chased the Zephyrians into the Altair sector, half the galaxy was watching the chase with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters and particularly dramatic sporting events. On the Centauran diplomatic station orbiting Proxima b, Ambassador Clithara of the Rigelian Confederacy was having what humans would have called a moment, though Rigelians didn't actually experience time linearly, and thus had to approximate the concept through careful manipulation of their probability matrices. "Explain this to me again," Clithara said to the assembled diplomatic corps, their voice carrying the kind of controlled bewilderment that suggested reality had taken an unexpected left turn and forgotten to leave a forwarding address. Trade Representative Quill of the Andromedan Collective, whose species had the unfortunate habit of communicating through color-shifting skin patterns that looked like a particularly aggressive mood ring having an existential crisis, rippled through what the universal translator interpreted as profound confusion mixed with grudging admiration. "The humans," Quill said, their skins cycling through shades that probably meant something deeply significant in their native language, "appear to be engaging in what they call making a point. And this point involves chasing one of the most powerful fleets in the sector across half the galaxy? Apparently. Clithara consulted their datapad, which was currently displaying a real-time tactical analysis of the pursuit that made absolutely no sense from any conventional standpoint. The human ship should have been destroyed, disabled, or at the very least convinced to pursue more reasonable diplomatic channels. Instead, it was gaining on the Zephyrian fleet with the kind of relentless determination usually associated with force-of-nature events. "Have we tried contacting them?" Clithara asked, perhaps suggesting that this whole affair has gone far enough. Cultural attaché Vexmol of the Tau Cetian Empire, whose species communicated entirely through subsonic vibrations that made every conversation sound like it was being held inside a particularly large and agitated whale, produced a series of harmonics that translated as deep skepticism with overtones of existential dread. "We tried," Vexmol rumbled. "The human captain thanked us for our concern and asked if we'd like to place bets on how long it would take them to catch the Zephyrians." Bets? Apparently human warfare includes an element of recreational wagering. Clithara stared at the tactical display, where the human ship continued its impossible pursuit, with the kind of single-minded focus that suggested its crew had either found enlightenment or completely lost their minds. Possibly both. "What exactly are they planning to do when they catch the Zephyrian fleet?" they asked. "That," said a new voice from the chamber's entrance, "is an excellent question." Everyone turned to see Admiral Threshkata of the Vegan Defense Force, whose species had the dubious distinction of being the only one in the galaxy that humans consistently described as pretty reasonable, actually. This was largely because vegans had learned, through careful observation and a healthy respect for statistical probability, that humans were best dealt with through a combination of patient diplomacy and staying very, very far away when they got excited about something. "Admiral," Clithara said, "do you have insight into human tactical doctrine?" Threshkata settled into one of the chamber's adaptive seating units, which immediately adjusted itself to accommodate their physiology while making soft, reassuring sounds that suggested everything was going to be fine. This was a lie, but it was a comforting one. "Human tactical doctrine," Threshkata said slowly, "is based on a fundamental principle that most species find difficult to comprehend. They don't actually have tactical doctrine." "I'm sorry?" "They have guidelines. Suggestions. General principles that they apply with what they call creative flexibility." Threshkata pulled up their own data display, which showed a comprehensive analysis of human military engagements dating back to their pre-spaceflight era. "Look at their history. They've fought wars with everything from pointed sticks to antimatter bombs, and their approach has remained remarkably consistent. Identify the problem, Apply violence until the problem goes away, then argue about whether they use too much violence or not enough. Quill's skin patterns shifted to what the translator interpreted as growing alarm. And they're applying this approach to galactic diplomacy? They're applying this approach to everything, Threshikata confirmed. That ship out there? It's not just chasing the Zephyrian fleet, it's making a statement. It's saying that humans don't care about your superior technology, your tactical advantages, or your reasonable expectations about how conflicts are supposed to be resolved. It's saying that if you start a fight with humanity, they will chase you to the end of the universe and beyond, just to prove a point. What point? Klithara asked, though they were beginning to suspect they didn't want to hear the answer. That they can. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft humming of the station's environmental systems, and the occasional color shift from Quill's increasingly agitated skin patterns. We should probably start drafting a new set of galactic engagement protocols, Klithara said finally. Already working on it, Threshikata confirmed. First rule. Don't start fights with humans unless you're absolutely certain you can finish them. Second rule. Be very, very certain about that first rule. On the main display, the human ship continued its relentless pursuit, a small, stubborn dot against the vastness of space, chasing down an entire fleet with the kind of determination that suggested its crew had either found the secret to eternal happiness or had collectively decided that conventional wisdom was for other people. Either way, the galaxy was learning that humans were going to be a problem. Chapter 5. The Zephyrian Command Crisis. High Admiral Zexthul was beginning to understand why so many great military leaders throughout history had developed drinking problems. Not that Zephyrians drank in the traditional sense. Their species processed nutrients through a complex filtration system that made alcohol consumption both technically impossible and philosophically redundant, but the concept was beginning to make a disturbing amount of sense. Status report, he ordered, though every previous status report had contained essentially the same information. They were still running, the humans were still chasing them, and the universe's basic laws of physics were apparently taking a personal day. Subcommander Yith Tal approached with the cautious gait of someone who'd realized that delivering bad news had become his primary job function. Sir, the human vessel has closed to within 50,000 kilometers and is still gaining. Our fleet's maximum sustainable velocity appears to be inadequate. Inadequate, Zexithul repeated flatly. Our ships are the fastest in the sector. Our engineers are the finest in the galaxy. Our technology is centuries ahead of anything those primitives should be capable of producing. And you're telling me it's inadequate? Yes, sir. Also, we're receiving communications from Zephyrian High Command. Zexthul's primary heart sank. Communications from High Command during an ongoing operation were never good news. And communications from High Command during an ongoing operation that had gone completely sideways were usually the kind of news that ended with court-martial proceedings and uncomfortable questions about competence. Put them through, he said, settling into his command throne with the resigned air of someone about to receive a thorough and well-deserved lecture. The main display flickered, and suddenly they were looking at Grand Admiral Kexthul, Zexthul's direct superior, and a Zephyrian whose military record was so impressive it required its own dedicated data storage facility. Kexthul had conquered more star systems than most species had ever discovered, defeated enemies that made the legendary monsters of Zephyrian mythology look like particularly aggressive houseplants, and generally established himself as one of the most feared military commanders in galactic history. He was also, at the moment, looking at Zexthul with the expression of someone trying to solve a particularly difficult mathematical equation, while simultaneously being attacked by bees. Zexthul, Kexthul said, his voice carrying the kind of carefully controlled disappointment usually reserved for parents discussing their children's more embarrassing life choices. Explain to me why our fastest battle fleet is currently fleeing from a single human vessel. Sir, Zexithul began, then paused as he realized he didn't actually have a good answer to that question. The humans have proven to be more persistent than anticipated. Persistent. Kexthul's voice dropped to the tone Zephyrians used when they were trying very hard not to express opinions that would be inappropriate for military communications. One ship, Zexthul, one ship against an entire battle fleet, and you describe them as persistent. Sir, their vessel appears to be capable of performance parameters that exceed theoretical maximums for their technology level. Our analysts believe they may have made modifications to their propulsion systems that should, by all rights, result in catastrophic engine failure. Should result in engine failure, Kexthul repeated, but hasn't. No, sir. And in the meantime, you're leading them on a chase across 3 star systems, providing them with what amounts to a guided tour of our defensive positions and strategic capabilities. Zexthul felt his secondary heart skip a beat. He hadn't thought about it that way, but Kexithul was absolutely right. Every system they passed through, every course correction they made, every tactical maneuver they attempted, it was all being observed, recorded, and presumably analyzed by the humans. "Sir," he said carefully, "what are your orders?" Kexthul was silent for a long moment, and Zexthul could practically hear the gears turning in his superior's mind. The Grand Admiral had faced impossible odds before, had outmaneuvered enemies with superior technology in greater numbers, had turned certain defeat into glorious victory through tactical brilliance and strategic innovation. But this was different. This was a single ship that simply refused to acknowledge that it was supposed to lose. "Turn and fight," Kexthul said finally. "Sir, you heard me. Turn the fleet around and engage the human vessel. Destroy it, disable it, capture it, I don't care. But end this chase before it becomes a running joke throughout the galaxy. Sir, our intelligence suggests that engaging the humans directly may be inadvisable. Their species has a documented tendency toward extreme responses when challenged." "Zexthul," Kexthul said, and his voice carried the kind of patience usually associated with teachers explaining basic concepts to particularly slow students. "They are already engaging us directly. They have been chasing our fleet across half the sector with a single ship. The humans have proven to be more persistent than anticipated." "Persistent." Kexithula's voice dropped to the tone Zephyrians used when they were trying very hard not to express opinions that would be inappropriate for military communications. "One ship, Zexithul. One ship against an entire battle fleet, and you describe them as persistent." "Sir, their vessel appears to be capable of performance parameters that exceed theoretical maximums for their technology level. Our analysts believe they may have made modifications to their propulsion systems that should, by all rights, result in catastrophic engine failure." "Should result in engine failure," Kexthul repeated, "but hasn't." "No, sir. And in the meantime, you're leading them on a chase across 3 star systems, providing them with what amounts to a guided tour of our defensive positions and strategic capabilities." Zexithul felt his secondary heart skip a beat. He hadn't thought about it that way, but Kexthul was absolutely right. Every system they passed through, every course correction they made, every tactical maneuver they attempted, it was all being observed, recorded, and presumably analyzed by the humans. "Sir," he said carefully, "what are your orders?" Kexthul was silent for a long moment, and Zexthul could practically hear the gears turning in his superior's mind. The Grand Admiral had faced impossible odds before, had outmaneuvered enemies with superior technology in greater numbers, had turned certain defeat into glorious victory through tactical brilliance and strategic innovation. But this was different. This was a single ship that simply refused to acknowledge that it was supposed to lose. "Turn and fight," Kexthul said finally. "Sir, you heard me. Turn the fleet around and engage the human vessel. Destroy it, disable it, capture it, I don't care. But end this chase before it becomes a running joke throughout the galaxy. Sir, our intelligence suggests that engaging the humans directly may be inadvisable. Their species has a documented tendency toward extreme responses when challenged." "Zexthul," Kexthul said, and his voice carried the kind of patience usually associated with teachers explaining basic concepts to particularly slow students. "They are already engaging us directly. They have been chasing our fleet across half the sector with a single ship." "How much more extreme can their response get?" As if in response to this question, the communications board lit up with an incoming transmission from the human vessel. "Sir," Communications Officer Plithmore reported, "the humans are attempting to establish contact." "Put them through," both admirals said simultaneously. The display split, showing both the bridge of the Zephyrian flagship and what appeared to be the human command center. Captain Rivers was there, looking entirely too pleased with himself, along with several other humans who seemed to be treating this whole situation as a particularly entertaining afternoon's entertainment. "Admirals," Rivers said cheerfully, somehow managing to make the plural sound like he was addressing a group of particularly slow children. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." Kexthul stepped forward, drawing himself up to his full, impressive height. "Human Captain, I am Grand Admiral Kexthul of the Zephyrian Imperial Navy. This pursuit will cease immediately, or we will be forced to take defensive action." "Defensive action?" Rivers repeated, and his smile widened in a way that made both Zephyrian admirals unconsciously take a step backward. "That's interesting terminology for someone who started this whole thing by showing up at one of our colonies and demanding tribute." "That was a diplomatic overture," Kexthul said stiffly. Standard procedure for establishing relations with newly encountered species. Ah, well, here's the thing about that, Rivers said, settling back in his command chair with the air of someone about to explain something very obvious to someone very dense. Humans have our own standard procedure for that kind of diplomatic overture. Which is? Rivers's smile became positively predatory. We chase you until you stop running, and then we have a more thorough conversation about boundaries and proper galactic etiquette. The transmission ended, leaving both Zephyrian bridges in the kind of silence usually associated with funerals, and particularly awkward first dates. Sir, Zexathul said quietly, I believe we may have underestimated the humans. Turn and fight, Kexathul repeated, though his voice lacked some of its earlier conviction. All ships, battle formation. Let's show these primitives what the Zephyrian Empire is capable of. Neither admiral mentioned that they were no longer entirely sure what the humans might be capable of in response. Chapter 6. The Art of Unreasonable Warfare. The thing about space battles, Captain Rivers had learned over his years of service, was that they rarely went according to plan. This was partly due to the inherent chaos of combat, partly due to the tendency of enemy commanders to be frustratingly uncooperative about following your tactical expectations, and partly due to what military theorists politely called the human factor. The human factor was a concept that most other species found deeply disturbing, largely because it suggested that humans treated warfare less like a science and more like a particularly violent form of improvisational theater. Sir, Lieutenant Commander Park reported from his tactical station. The Zephyrian fleet is changing course. They're turning around. Rivers nodded, unsurprised. He'd been wondering how long it would take them to realize that running away wasn't actually solving their problem. Formation? Standard battle line, heavy cruisers in front, support vessels in reserve. Textbook deployment, sir. Good for them, Rivers said approvingly. They've got proper training. I respect that in an enemy. Park blinked. Sir, they outnumber us 43-1. Their ships are individually more powerful than ours. They have superior technology, better weapons, more experienced crews, and home field advantage. Your point? My point is that any rational analysis of this situation suggests we should be preparing to die heroically while inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy. Rivers turned to look at his tactical officer with the expression of a teacher who'd just heard a student ask whether 1 + 1 might possibly equal 17. David, how long have you served aboard this ship? 8 months, sir. And in that time, how many situations have we encountered that any rational analysis suggested we couldn't handle? Park considered this question, running through a mental catalog of the stubborn bastard's recent adventures. The incident with the pirate fleet that had somehow ended with them providing technical support to the local system defense force, the diplomatic crisis that had been resolved through what the official reports described as creative interpretation of first contact protocols, and the border skirmish with the Regelian Confederacy that had concluded with both sides sharing technical specifications and recipe exchanges. All of them, sir, he admitted. And how many of those situations did we fail to resolve in a manner satisfactory to Earth interests? None, sir, but... No buts, David. The universe is full of species that approach problems rationally, logically, with careful consideration of costs and benefits and risk assessments. They follow doctrine, they stick to established procedures, they make sensible decisions based on available data. Rivers stood up, which meant things were about to get interesting, and that's exactly why they're going to lose. Sir? Because humans don't do rational. Rivers gestured toward the main screen, where the Zephyrian fleet was deploying into attack formation with the kind of precise, military efficiency that suggested they'd practiced this maneuver countless times. We do determined. We do stubborn. We do hold my beer and watch this. The communications board chimed with an incoming transmission request from the Zephyrian flagship. Rivers nodded to the communications officer, who opened the channel with the air of someone starting a particularly dangerous scientific experiment. Grand Admiral Kexthul appeared on the main screen, looking every inch the seasoned military commander. Calm, professional, and utterly confident in his tactical superiority. Behind him, the bridge of his flagship hummed with quiet efficiency, crew members going about their duties with the kind of practiced competence that came from years of successful military campaigns. Captain Rivers, Kexthul said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd won more battles than most species had ever fought. This is your final warning. Withdraw immediately or we will open fire. Grand Admiral, Rivers replied cheerfully, I appreciate the warning. Very professional of you, but I'm afraid we're going to have to decline your generous offer. You realize you're outgunned, outmanned, and facing impossible odds? Story of my life, Rivers confirmed. Though I should probably mention that humans have a bit of a reputation when it comes to impossible odds. Which is? River's smile became the kind of expression that made seasoned warriors check their weapons and consider updating their wills. We take them personally. The transmission cut off, and the bridge of the stubborn bastard settled into the familiar pre-combat routine that every member of the crew knew by heart. Weapons checks, shield adjustments, and the quiet mental preparation that came with knowing you were about to attempt something that violated several laws of physics and at least 2 principles of common sense. Engineering to bridge, came Chief Kowalski's voice over the comm, carrying that particular mix of excitement and barely controlled terror that meant she'd been working on something that would either save them all or result in a very brief but spectacular explosion. Go ahead, Lisa. Remember how you wanted to know what would happen when we caught them? Yeah? Well, we're about to find out. I've got something new for you, Captain. Something I've been working on since we left Kepler Colony. Rivers felt that familiar tingle of anticipation that came with knowing his chief engineer had been thinking creatively about problems. What kind of something? The kind that's either going to make us legendary or get us all court-martialed, possibly both. I love it when you talk dirty, Lisa. What do you need? Just give me the word, Captain, and maybe say a little prayer to whatever deity watches over engineers who've had too much caffeine and access to restricted technical manuals. Rivers looked around his bridge, taking in the faces of his crew. They were all looking at him with the kind of expression that suggested they'd figured out their captain was about to do something typically human. Which was to say, something that made perfect sense to humans, and absolutely no sense to anyone else in the galaxy. Any last words? He asked cheerfully. Sir, Park said, just to clarify, we're really going to engage an entire battle fleet with a single ship? David, Rivers said patiently, we're not just going to engage them. We're going to win. How? Rivers settled back into his command chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just figured out the punchline to the galaxy's best joke. By being unreasonable. Chapter 7. The Kowalski Doctrine. If there was one thing Chief Engineer Lisa Kowalski had learned during her 15 years of service aboard various Earth Defense Force vessels, it was that the phrase, "that's impossible," was really more of a suggestion than an actual limitation. This was particularly true when the person saying it wasn't human, which meant they probably hadn't spent their formative years learning that impossible things happened all the time, and the trick was figuring out how to make them happen on purpose. The engine room of the stubborn bastard was currently exemplifying this principle in ways that would have made physics professors weep and safety inspectors seriously reconsider their career choices. What had started as a standard starship propulsion system had been modified, enhanced, and occasionally threatened until it now resembled something that might have been designed by someone who'd learned engineering from fever dreams and technical manuals written in crayon. Okay, people, Kowalski announced to her engineering team. Time to find out if 3 months of theoretical impossibility translates into practical impossibility or just really impressive explosions. Senior Engineer Martinez, whose job description had somehow evolved from maintain ship systems to help the chief engineer violate fundamental laws of reality, looked up from his console with the expression of someone who'd made peace with his mortality, but was still hoping for a decent pension. Chief, he said carefully, the reactor output is already at 115% of rated capacity. The containment fields are holding, but the harmonics are making the deck plates sing opera in languages that don't exist. That's just the ship expressing its feelings, Martinez. Perfectly normal. Kowalski moved to the central engineering console, which was currently displaying readouts that suggested their ship was either achieving a new form of enlightenment or preparing to become a very bright, very brief star. What about the structural integrity fields? Holding at 98% efficiency, which is pretty good considering we're asking them to keep the ship together while we do things that should probably require divine intervention. Kowalski nodded, running through mental calculations that involved equal parts advanced mathematics and what she privately called optimistic guesswork. The modification she'd been working on was based on a principle that most engineers would have dismissed as theoretical at best and hallucinogenic at worst. If you could convince the ship's systems that they were capable of performance beyond their design specifications, they would obligingly attempt to live up to your expectations. This worked surprisingly well with human-built ships, which seemed to respond positively to encouragement, mild threats, and the occasional heartfelt speech about duty and determination. It worked less well with alien technology, which tended to be more rational about its limitations and less susceptible to motivational speeches. Bridge to engineering, came Captain Rivers' voice over the comm. Lisa, we're about 30 seconds away from finding out whether your miracle is going to work. Please tell me you haven't accidentally invented a new form of matter. Nothing that exotic, Captain, Kowalski replied, making final adjustments to systems that were definitely not supposed to be adjusted during combat operations. Just a little creative interpretation of the relationship between energy and matter. Should I be worried? Captain, if you weren't worried, I'd be concerned about your psychological fitness for command. Fair point. Initiate on my mark. Kowalski took a deep breath, looked around at her engineering team, who were all wearing the expression of people about to participate in something that would either make history or end it, and prepared to demonstrate why human engineering was considered a contradiction in terms by most of the galaxy. Ready when you are, Captain. Chapter 8. The Battle of Unreasonable Expectations. The opening moments of what would later be known throughout the galaxy as the Battle of Unreasonable Expectations, though humans would insist on calling it that time we taught physics a lesson, began with what appeared to be a perfectly normal space engagement. Two forces meeting in the void, weapons charging, tactical systems calculating optimal firing solutions. This lasted approximately 15 seconds, which was how long it took for the stubborn bastard to demonstrate that human approaches to warfare were less tactical engagement and more physics-defying performance art. All ships, Grand Admiral Kexthal commanded from his flagship. Commence firing. Target the human vessel's engines and command section. The Zephyrian fleet opened fire with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke to centuries of military tradition and tactical doctrine. Plasma beams lanced across space in carefully calculated patterns, designed to overwhelm the human ship's defenses and end the engagement as quickly and efficiently as possible. The beams struck the stubborn bastard's shields and bounced, not absorbed, not dissipated, not even significantly reduced in intensity. They bounced, ricocheting off the human ship's defensive grid like rubber balls off a brick wall, some of them flying back toward the Zephyrian fleet with enough energy to trigger their own defensive systems. Sir, Subcommander Yithtal reported, his voice carrying the kind of careful confusion that suggested reality had taken another unexpected detour. The human vessel's defensive capabilities appear to exceed our projections. By how much? By all of it, sir. Our weapons are having no measurable effect. Kexthal stared at the tactical display, where the human ship was represented by a small blue dot that was now accelerating toward his fleet, with the kind of single-minded determination that suggested its crew had either achieved enlightenment or completely lost their minds. Increase firepower, he ordered. All ships, maximum yield. The Zephyrian fleet complied, pouring enough energy into space to sterilize a small moon. The stubborn bastard flew through the barrage like it was a gentle spring rain, its shields not just holding, but actually seeming to grow brighter with each hit. On the human ship's bridge, Captain Rivers was watching this display with the expression of someone enjoying a particularly good fireworks show. Lisa, he said into his comm, I don't suppose you'd like to explain how our shields are currently violating several fundamental laws of thermodynamics? Well, Captain, came Kowalski's voice, tinged with the kind of pride that came from successfully proving that the universe's rules were more like guidelines. It turns out that if you run enough power through the shield generators while simultaneously convincing them that they're actually part of a much larger system, they start behaving like they're part of a much larger system. And what system would that be? The ship's entire power grid, including the engines, life support, and that experimental reactor modification I've been working on. Rivers paused, processing this information. Are you telling me that our shields are being powered by the entire ship? I'm telling you that our shields think they're being powered by the entire ship. Turns out, belief is a powerful thing when you're dealing with systems that are already operating beyond their design specifications. And what happens when the Zephyrians figure out what we're doing? Captain, Kowalski said cheerfully, they're not going to figure out what we're doing, because what we're doing shouldn't be possible. They're going to keep trying to solve the problem using conventional methods, which means they're going to keep failing until they run out of ammunition or start questioning their understanding of reality. I love it when you talk like that, Lisa. How long can we maintain this? As long as the crew keeps believing it's going to work. Rivers looked around his bridge, taking in the faces of his crew. They were all staring at the tactical display with the kind of awed fascination that came from watching their ship do something that should have been physically impossible. And they were all grinning like children who'd just discovered that the laws of physics were more like friendly suggestions. I don't think that's going to be a problem, Rivers said. On the Zephyrian flagship, Grand Admiral Kexthal was beginning to understand why so many great military leaders throughout history had developed a tendency toward philosophical contemplation during combat operations. Status report, he demanded, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to hear the answer. Sir, we've expended 60% of our ammunition reserves with no measurable effect on the enemy vessel. Their defensive systems appear to be adaptive. Adaptive how? They're getting stronger, sir. Each time we hit them, their shields become more effective. It's as if they're learning from our attacks. Kexthal stared at the tactical display, where the human ship was now close enough that he could make out individual details of its hull configuration. It looked exactly like what it was. A mid-range cruiser that should have been reduced to component atoms within the first 30 seconds of engagement. Instead, it was flying through his fleet's combined firepower like it was on a pleasant afternoon cruise, and its shields were now glowing with an intensity that suggested they were powered by a small star. Sir, his communications officer reported, we're receiving another transmission from the human vessel. Put it through, Kexthal said, because at this point he figured things couldn't possibly get any worse. This turned out to be another significant error in judgment. Captain Rivers appeared on the main screen, looking entirely too pleased with himself and the universe in general. Behind him, the human bridge crew was going about their duties with the casual air of people who were having a perfectly normal day, despite being engaged in what any reasonable species would consider a fundamental violation of natural law. Admiral, Rivers said cheerfully, I hope you're enjoying the demonstration. I thought you might be interested to know that we're just getting started. Captain, Kexthal said, drawing on reserves of diplomatic training that had never been intended for situations quite this surreal. Your vessel's performance is impressive. Perhaps we could discuss terms? Terms? Rivers looked genuinely surprised. Admiral, this isn't a negotiation, this is a learning experience. What exactly are you trying to teach us? Rivers's smile became the kind of expression that made seasoned warriors check their weapons and consider whether their wills were up to date. That humans don't follow the same rules as everyone else, he said, and that if you're going to pick a fight with us, you'd better be prepared for us to fight back in ways that don't make sense to anyone, including us. The transmission cut off, leaving the Zephyrian bridge in the kind of silence usually associated with religious experiences and particularly traumatic medical procedures. Sir, Yithtal said quietly, what are your orders? Kexthal looked at the tactical display, where the human ship was now close enough that its shields were interfering with his own sensors, creating a kind of localized aurora effect that was probably very pretty if you weren't trying to target it with weapons that appeared to be completely ineffective. Withdraw, he said finally. Sir, you heard me. All ships withdraw to minimum safe distance. Do not engage the human vessel. Sir, our orders from High Command. Our orders from High Command, Kexthal said quietly, were based on the assumption that we were dealing with a rational enemy employing conventional tactics. That assumption appears to have been optimistic. On his display, the human ship continued its approach, now close enough that he could see the markings on its hull. Earth Defense Force, and below that, in smaller text that suggested someone in their naming department had a sense of humor. Stubborn bastard. The name, Kexthal realized, was remarkably appropriate. Chapter 9. The Teaching Moment. The thing about humans, Admiral Threshikata reflected, as they watched the tactical feeds from the battle of unreasonable expectations, was that they had an unfortunate tendency to treat warfare like a particularly violent form of education. And like most teachers, they seemed to believe that the best way to make sure their students understood the lesson was to keep repeating it until everyone in the class could recite it from memory. The diplomatic observation station was currently hosting representatives from 17 different species, all of whom were watching the engagement with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters and particularly spectacular traffic accidents. Status report, Threshikata requested, though they were beginning to suspect that traditional military terminology wasn't really adequate for describing what they were witnessing. The human vessel has successfully neutralized the Zephyrian fleet's offensive capabilities, reported their tactical analyst, a young vegan whose job it was to translate human military actions into language that made sense to civilized species. They accomplished this without firing a single shot. How? Near as we can tell, sir, they convinced their shields to violate thermodynamics, then flew close enough to the Zephyrian ships to demonstrate that conventional weapons are apparently optional when you're determined enough. Threshikata nodded slowly. This was, unfortunately, entirely consistent with previous human military engagements. Humans had a documented tendency to approach problems by ignoring the established rules for solving them, which worked surprisingly well right up until other species started trying to figure out what the new rules were supposed to be. What's the human ship doing now? They appear to be circling the Zephyrian fleet, sir. Circling? Like a predator stalking prey. Very slowly, very deliberately. The Zephyrians are maintaining position but not engaging. Threshkata brought up their own tactical display, which showed the human vessel moving in a lazy spiral around the much larger Zephyrian formation. It was, they had to admit, a remarkably effective psychological tactic. Instead of pressing their apparent advantage, the humans were simply demonstrating that they could have pressed it, if they'd wanted to. Which was, when you thought about it, far more terrifying than actually attacking. "Sir," their communications officer reported, "we're receiving a transmission from the human vessel. They're broadcasting on an open channel." "To us?" "To everyone, sir, the entire sector." Threshkata considered this. An open transmission during a military engagement was unusual. But then again, everything about this engagement had been unusual. "Put it through." The main display flickered, and suddenly they were looking at the bridge of the human ship. Captain Rivers was there, looking relaxed and comfortable, as if he was hosting a casual dinner party rather than conducting what appeared to be a masterclass in unconventional warfare. "Greetings," Rivers said, his voice carrying the kind of friendly authority that suggested he was addressing a group of particularly attentive students. "To our friends throughout the galactic community who are currently observing this engagement. I thought this might be a good time for a brief educational presentation." He gestured toward what appeared to be a tactical display showing the current positions of both fleets. "As you can see, we have here a fairly standard military situation. A large, well-equipped fleet with superior numbers and firepower, facing a single vessel with what any reasonable analysis would suggest are inadequate resources for the task at hand." The display zoomed in on the human ship, which was indeed laughably small compared to the Zephyrian formation. Now, conventional military doctrine would suggest that this engagement should have been over in the first 30 seconds, with the smaller vessel either destroyed or forced to withdraw. Rivers paused, and his smile became the kind of expression that suggested he was about to explain something very obvious to someone very dense. "But here's the thing about humans. We don't really do conventional. We prefer what you might call creative problem-solving." The display shifted, showing the engagement from the beginning. The Zephyrian fleet opening fire, the human ship's shields somehow deflecting everything thrown at them. The gradual realization that normal weapons were having no effect whatsoever. "See, when most species encounter a problem," Rivers continued, "they try to solve it using established methods, proven techniques, conventional wisdom. But humans? We look at a problem and think, I wonder what would happen if we tried something completely insane." He gestured toward the tactical display again, where the human ship was continuing its slow, predatory circle around the Zephyrian fleet. "Take our current situation. The Zephyrians showed up at one of our colonies, made some demands, fired some warning shots. Standard aggressive diplomacy, the kind of thing that happens all the time in galactic politics." Rivers's expression became more serious, though the smile never quite disappeared. "But they made a fundamental error in judgment. They assumed that because we're new to the galactic community, we'd follow the same rules as everyone else." The transmission paused for a moment, and Threshkata realized that every species representative in the observation station was hanging on the human captain's every word. "Here's what they didn't understand," Rivers continued. "Humans don't follow rules. We follow principles. And our first principle is this. If you start a fight with us, we will finish it. Not just win it, not just make you go away, but finish it in a way that makes absolutely certain you never want to start another one." The display showed the current tactical situation. The Zephyrian fleet, weapons powered down, maintaining defensive positions while the human ship continued its leisurely orbit. "Right now," Rivers said cheerfully, "the Zephyrian fleet could probably still destroy us, if they were willing to accept the casualties. They've got the numbers, they've got the firepower, and they've certainly got the training. But they won't do it, because they've figured out something important." "What's that?" Threshkata found themselves saying, though they immediately felt foolish for talking to a recording. As if he'd heard the question, Rivers' smile widened. "They figured out that fighting humans isn't about tactics or technology or superior numbers. It's about whether you're prepared to deal with an enemy that treats warfare like a particularly violent form of artistic expression." The transmission ended, leaving the observation station in the kind of silence usually associated with religious experiences and particularly sobering mathematical proofs. "Admiral," their communications officer said quietly, "what do we do with this information?" Threshkata looked around the station, taking in the faces of the various species representatives. They were all wearing the expression of people who'd just realized that the galaxy had become a significantly more complicated place. "We update our diplomatic protocols," they said finally, "and we make sure everyone understands the new rules." "What are the new rules?" Don't start fights with humans unless you're absolutely certain you can finish them, Threshkata said. And be very, very certain about that first rule. Chapter 10. The New Galactic Order. 6 months after the Battle of Unreasonable Expectations, the galaxy had settled into what diplomatic historians would later describe as the new normal. Though most species agreed that there was nothing particularly normal about a situation where one relatively small species had managed to completely rewrite the rules of interstellar relations through the simple expedient of refusing to follow them in the first place. Captain Rivers was currently demonstrating this principle during what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic meeting on the neutral station, orbiting Tau Ceti Prime. The meeting had been called to establish formal protocols for human interaction with the various galactic powers, and it was going about as well as most attempts to establish formal protocols with humans, which was to say it had devolved into something that looked more like a philosophy seminar conducted by particularly enthusiastic graduate students. The problem, Rivers was explaining to the assembled diplomatic corps, is that you're all thinking about this backwards. Ambassador Clithara of the Regelian Confederacy, who had been tasked with chairing this particular exercise in diplomatic futility, rippled through what their species used to express polite confusion. Captain Rivers, perhaps you could clarify your position. Sure, Rivers said, settling back in his chair with the air of someone who was enjoying himself entirely too much. You're all trying to figure out how to incorporate humans into your existing system of galactic politics. Treaties, protocols, spheres of influence, proper procedures for this and that. He gestured around the conference room, where representatives from over 20 species were gathered in what was supposed to be a harmonious display of interstellar cooperation. But that's not how humans work. We don't fit into systems. We create new systems, usually by accident, and then we spend the next few centuries arguing about whether they make any sense. Trade Representative Quill of the Andromedan Collective shifted through color patterns that the Universal Translator interpreted as growing alarm mixed with grudging fascination. Are you suggesting that humans are incapable of following established diplomatic procedures? I'm suggesting that humans following established diplomatic procedures is like asking a hurricane to follow traffic laws, Rivers replied cheerfully. Technically possible, I suppose, but you probably shouldn't count on it. Grand Admiral Kex Thul, who had been invited to this meeting as a representative of the Zephyrian Empire, and was still dealing with what his military psychologists had diagnosed as acute reality adjustment syndrome, spoke up from his position at the far end of the table. Captain Rivers, he said carefully, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that instead of trying to make humans fit into your system, you adapt your system to account for humans, Rivers said. Because like it or not, we're here, we're not going anywhere. And we're going to keep doing human things, regardless of whether they make sense to anyone else. And what precisely are human things? Asked Cultural Attaché Vexmol of the Tau Cetian Empire. Rivers considered this question for a moment, running through a mental catalog of humanity's recent contributions to galactic civilization. Well, there was the incident with the Regelian trade dispute that we solved by challenging their negotiating team to a series of competitive eating contests. There was the border conflict with the Centauran Republic that we resolved by accidentally inventing a new form of music. And there was that whole thing with the Andromedan pirates that ended with us providing technical support for their ship upgrades. You helped pirates upgrade their ships? Clithara asked, their voice carrying the kind of careful disbelief that suggested they were beginning to understand why human diplomacy was considered a contradiction in terms. They weren't very good pirates, Rivers explained. Terrible fuel efficiency, outdated navigation systems, crew quarters that violated about 17 different standards for basic habitability. We felt bad for them. So you helped them become better pirates? We helped them become better people who happen to be pirates. Turns out, when you give someone the tools to do their job more efficiently, they often discover they'd rather be doing a different job entirely. The conference room fell silent as the assembled diplomats processed this information. It was, several of them realized, a perfect example of the human approach to problem solving. Identify the issue, apply a solution that made no sense from any conventional standpoint, and somehow end up with results that were better than anyone had expected. Captain, Admiral Threshkata said finally, what you're describing isn't diplomacy, I'm not sure what it is. It's humans being human, Rivers said simply. Which, when you think about it, is probably the most diplomatic thing we can do. How do you figure that? Because the alternative is humans trying to be something else, and trust me, that never ends well for anyone involved. Ambassador Clithara consulted their notes, which by this point looked more like the scribblings of someone trying to solve a particularly complex mathematical equation while being attacked by caffeinated monkeys. Captain Rivers, are you saying that human diplomatic policy is to be yourselves? More or less, Rivers confirmed, with the understanding that being ourselves includes a certain degree of flexibility when it comes to conventional wisdom, established procedures, and basic laws of physics. And you believe this approach will lead to stable, long-term relations with the galactic community? Rivers smiled, and several of the assembled diplomats unconsciously checked their emergency evacuation routes. Ambassador, 6 months ago, nobody in this room had ever heard of humans. Today, we're sitting around a table discussing how to reorganize galactic politics to account for our existence. I'd say our approach is working pretty well so far. Grand Admiral Kexthal, who had been silent for most of the discussion, finally spoke up. Captain, may I ask you a question? Sure. Why didn't you destroy my fleet when you had the chance? Rivers turned to look at the Zephyrian admiral, and his expression became more serious than it had been throughout the entire conference. Because destroying your fleet wouldn't have solved the problem, Admiral. It would have just created a bigger one. I don't understand. If we'd destroyed your fleet, every other species in the galaxy would have seen humans as aggressive, unpredictable, and dangerous. They would have started building alliances against us, developing countermeasures, preparing for the inevitable conflict with the violent newcomers. Rivers leaned forward, and his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that suggested he'd thought about this question long and hard. But by letting you go, by demonstrating that we could have destroyed you but chose not to, we sent a different message. We showed the galaxy that humans are willing to fight when necessary, capable of winning when we do fight, but also reasonable enough to know when to stop. And that's better? That's sustainable, Rivers said. Because now, instead of every species in the galaxy seeing us as a threat to be eliminated, they see us as a problem to be managed. And management, Admiral, is just another word for diplomacy. The conference room was quiet for a long moment as the assembled diplomats considered this perspective. It was, they had to admit, a remarkably sophisticated approach to interstellar relations, even if it had been implemented through methods that violated most known principles of military science. So, Ambassador Clithara said finally, what happens now? Rivers smiled, and this time it was the kind of expression that suggested he was genuinely pleased with the way things had turned out. Now we figure out how to work together. You bring your experience, your knowledge, your established systems and procedures. We bring our creative flexibility. And between all of us, maybe we can build something better than what any of us could have managed alone. And if that doesn't work, then we'll try something else, Rivers said cheerfully. Something probably just as ridiculous, just as impossible, and just as likely to succeed despite all rational expectations. He stood up, which was the signal that the human portion of the diplomatic proceedings had concluded. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted other sentient beings, it's been a pleasure. I look forward to seeing what kind of trouble we can all get into together. As Captain Rivers left the conference room, the assembled diplomats sat in silence, each of them trying to process what they'd just experienced. Finally, Admiral Threshkata spoke up. Well, they said, I suppose we'd better start updating our procedures manual. What should we put in it? Asked Ambassador Clithara. Rule 1. Humans don't follow rules, Threshkata said. Rule 2. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Rule 3. When in doubt, expect the unexpected and prepare to be surprised anyway. And Rule 4? Threshkata smiled, which was a rare expression for their species, and usually indicated either deep satisfaction or complete surrender to the inevitable. Rule 4. Never, ever bet against humans when they've decided they're right about something. Epilogue. The Human Factor. 1 year after the Battle of Unreasonable Expectations, the galaxy had settled into what most species agreed was a significantly more interesting place to live. Human influence had spread throughout the galactic community like a particularly enthusiastic virus, infecting everything from military doctrine to culinary preferences to the basic understanding of what was and wasn't possible when you applied sufficient determination to a problem. Captain Rivers, now promoted to Admiral Rivers, a promotion that had been accompanied by what Fleet Command described as mixed feelings and a strong recommendation for increased insurance coverage, was currently aboard the Earth Defense Force flagship Inevitable Determination, reviewing reports from human diplomatic missions throughout the sector. The reports made for entertaining reading. Sir, his aide, Lieutenant Commander Emily Carson, said as she entered his ready room with a stack of data pads. The latest dispatches from our embassy ships. Rivers accepted the pads with the expression of someone who'd learned that human diplomacy was best experienced in small doses. How bad is it this time? Well, Captain Stevens somehow managed to resolve the Andromedan succession crisis by introducing them to the concept of democratic elections. Captain Wilson ended the Rigelian-Centauran trade war by convincing both sides to collaborate on a joint venture to develop more efficient cargo containers. And Captain Foster... Carson paused, consulting her notes with the expression of someone trying to translate poetry written in a language that didn't exist. Captain Foster solved the territorial dispute between the vegans and the Tau Cetians by accidentally inventing a new form of interstellar sports league. Sports league? Apparently both species have been looking for a way to compete with each other that didn't involve actual warfare. Foster suggested they try competing in organized athletic events instead. Now they're planning a sector-wide tournament. Rivers nodded, unsurprised. This was, he'd learned, how human diplomacy worked. You started with one problem, applied human logic to it, and somehow ended up solving 3 different problems you hadn't known existed. Any actual crises I should know about? Nothing major, sir. Though Admiral Threshkata has requested a meeting with you when we reach the Tau Ceti station. They want to discuss something they're calling the human variable. The human variable? Apparently, they're trying to develop new mathematical models for predicting galactic political trends, and they're having trouble accounting for human involvement in various situations. Rivers smiled. Let me guess. We keep producing results that don't match their calculations? That's putting it mildly, sir. According to their latest analysis, human diplomatic interventions have a success rate that violates several principles of statistical probability. And they want to know how we do it? They want to know if we know how we do it, Carson said. There's apparently some debate in the galactic academic community about whether human diplomatic success is the result of careful planning or just really impressive luck. Rivers considered this question, running through a mental catalog of humanity's recent diplomatic achievements. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. Human diplomacy seemed to work through a combination of stubborn determination, creative problem-solving, and a willingness to ignore conventional wisdom when it got in the way of doing the right thing. Tell Admiral Threshkata I'll be happy to discuss the human variable with them, he said finally, though I should probably warn them that the answer might not be as scientific as they're hoping for. What should I tell them it is, sir? Rivers looked out the viewport of his ready room, where the stars of the galactic core were visible as a distant glow against the darkness of space. Somewhere out there, human crews were probably at this very moment solving problems that conventional wisdom said were unsolvable, making friends with species that conventional wisdom said were incompatible, and generally demonstrating that conventional wisdom was more of a suggestion than an actual limitation. Tell them it's the human factor, he said, and explain that the human factor is what happens when you take a species that evolved from persistence hunters, give them starships, and then turn them loose on a galaxy that's been following the same rules for the past 10,000 years. And if they ask what that means? Rivers smiled, and it was the kind of expression that had become synonymous throughout the galaxy with the phrase, humans being human. Tell them it means the rules just changed, he said, and that they'd better get used to it, because we're just getting started. As the inevitable determination continued its journey through the stars, carrying humanity's particular brand of diplomatic chaos to whatever corner of the galaxy needed it most, the universe settled into what was rapidly becoming its new normal. A place where impossible things happened on a regular basis, where conventional wisdom was treated as a mild suggestion, and where the most dangerous phrase in any language was, "Hold my beer and watch this." It was, most species agreed, a much more interesting place to live. Even if it was occasionally terrifying. But then again, as humans had taught the galaxy, sometimes terrifying and interesting were the same thing. And sometimes that was exactly what the universe needed. The end.